of this fantastic book, Welfare for Autocrats. I would say more about it, but you came here to listen to Jennifer, not to me. So without further ado, let me allow Jennifer to just take it away. Jennifer, please.
Great. Thank you so much for having me. I'm delighted to have the opportunity to share my new book with all of you. So the book centers around China's minimum livelihood guarantee, 中国最低生活保障, or Dibao for short. Dibao is a means-tested non-conditional cash transfer program. So means testing in this case refers to the fact that anyone with per capita household income below a certain locally set level is eligible. That locally set income level is called the Dibao line. The program is non-conditional, so households should receive the cash transfer if they're eligible. And so that contrasts with conditional cash transfer programs like Bolsa Familia in Brazil, where poor families receive money only if they do certain things like vaccinate their children or send their children to school. Dibao is the only, Dibao, I should say, is the largest non-conditional cash transfer program in the world by population covered. And it's the only non-regressive social welfare program in China. Other welfare programs, social policy such as health insurance in China privilege the wealthy over the poor, so they increase income inequality. And so Dibao stands out because it is non-regressive. Dibao is administered by the Minzheng civil affairs system. It's funded by central and local governments, and local governments are responsible for setting the Dibao line and other details of policy implementation. Just to give you a little bit of context for this program, Dibao is one of China's main social assistance programs. It's been around since the 1990s. It covers both rural and urban China. And the empirical evidence for my book is based on urban Dibao, which in 2017 covered about 13 million people, representing expenditures about 64 million Chinese yuan, 64 billion Chinese yuan. Okay. So although all of the empirical evidence in my book centers around Dibao, the book is not about Dibao per se. Instead, the book uses the Dibao program as a lens through which to examine the Chinese government's preoccupation with political order, or what it calls stability. By looking at the Dibao program, I uncover a phenomenon of informal institutional change that I call seepage. So seepage is a process through which one government priority here, political order, the pursuit of political order, alters the allocation of resources and goals of unrelated areas of government, Dibao. So by looking at Dibao, I can see how political order is seeping into programs unrelated to order in the Chinese context. So to give you an overview of what I'll talk about today, I'll first start by talking about how I came to write a book about the relationship between Dibao and political order. Then I'll talk about how the priorities of political order entered into the Dibao program. I'll talk about how this type of provision works in practice, and I'll talk about its consequences. The empirical evidence for the book comes from lots of different sources. I analyze speeches and policy documents at all levels of government. I conduct an online field experiment in over 2,000 counties in China. I conduct an original survey of 100 neighborhoods. I collected thousands of announcements related to Dibao. I conducted I included questions about Dibao in a nationally representative survey in urban China, and I used millions of social media posts to identify protest events. There are a lot of things in this book that are not easy to study directly, and that's why I had to rely on this diversity of sources and materials. But despite kind of this type of empirical analysis, the book really began with my qualitative fieldwork, where I originally just set out to understand the logic behind Dibao distribution. These are pictures of neighborhoods I visited in one of the cities where I did my initial fieldwork. And I should say, whenever I use the word neighborhood, I'm talking about the lowest administrative kind of division in China, 社区, the urban equivalent of villages, which are administered by 居委会, residence committees. From 2012 to 2013, I interviewed more than 100 government officials, neighborhood administrators, Dibao recipients, and other urban residents. And from these conversations, I encountered something a bit puzzling. When I talked to policymakers and neighborhood administrators about the Dibao program and the rationale for who gets Dibao, their emphasis was always about budget constraints that the program faced. So money was limited, local governments have a lot of top-down mandates and they can't fund them all. So that's a story we know about China, unfunded mandates. In addition, policymakers told me about opposition to welfare from the public and from businesses. The idea that this type of social assistance decreases incentives to work, and policymakers face pressures to make these benefits limited. Again, this is the type of pushback that you see in many countries. So as a result, my interviewees emphasize that Dibao is limited to the extremely poor who could not participate in the labor market and who had no means of other support. So for example, the disabled, the ill, the elderly without families. And a lot of my fieldwork confirmed this orientation. I heard stories of many poor households who were turned away from Dibao, they were told to work. But as I did more field work, not everything fit into this picture. When talking to some residence committees about the type of people who were receiving Dibao, in addition to hearing them talk about the elderly and the disabled, they talked about other recipients, like those who are 归正. And prior to this, I had never done any work on repression, China's prison or penal system, China's re-education system, crackdowns on religious practice. And it took me some time to even understand what a term such as 归正 meant. And it means a return from penal reform, from prison, from re-education. And as I dug into this more, I realized that there are two different logics to who gets Dibao. The first logic is what I heard from policymakers. Dibao acts as a safety net of last resort for people who cannot participate in the labor market. So this logic prioritizes individuals like the elderly who have low income. And because there's a hard budget constraint, not all impoverished households whose per capita household income is below that line are funded, are given the benefit. And so if you were poor but could work, local Dibao administrators would say, oh, it's gonna be really hard for you to get this benefit. You should just find another job or find some other means of bolstering your income. Right? So that's the story that I heard initially. But there's a second logic to distribution, which is the logic of distributing Dibao benefits to preempt threats to political order. And here, the priority is placed on individuals the regime sees as potential threats who have low income. So the programmatic features of the program are never violated. The benefit is not given to people whose income falls above the Dibao line, but it's given to people whose incomes are below that line and who pose a threat. Again, because of the hard budget constraint, low-income households who don't pose a threat to political order are denied and turned away from the program. So how did this all come about? Why are there these two different logics to Dibao distribution? Did the Ministry of Civil Affairs, which administers this program, decide one day that they would distribute Dibao in this way? Absolutely not. Did local governments decide, oh, I can buy people off by giving them Dibao, let's do that? No, they did not. The reason why Dibao is distributed to preempt threats to political order runs much broader and deeper. It has something to do with how the Chinese regime understands stability and how the Chinese regime pursues stability and changes to both its understanding of stability and its pursuit of stability in the 1990s and early 2000s. So everyone knows that the Chinese Communist Party cares about Weiwen and stability. And you often hear this quote from Deng Xiaoping in 1989, who said, the Chinese problems, the overwhelming priority is stability. Without a stable environment, nothing can be achieved, and what has been achieved will be lost. But what we need to remember is that stability wasn't always the end all and be all. After Tiananmen in 1989, Deng's ultimate objective was not stability. it was economic modernization. In 1992, Deng Xiaoping reaffirmed his support for economic modernization during his Southern tour. A year later, in 1993, during the third plenum of the 14th Central Committee, the Central Committee adopted decisions of the CPC Central Committee on certain issues in establishing a socialist market economy system. So this is a really crucial document for China's economic reforms. And in the same document, it calls for the development of a multi-layered social security system that provides urban and rural residents with a degree of security commensurate to China's reality so as to promote economic development and social stability. So the idea is that at this point, post-Tiananmen, the goal is about economic reform, and unrest could hinder economic progress. So unrest should be managed with social security and a social safety net. And this view was supported by the type of protest that characterized China in the 1990s. So throughout the 1990s, the CCP dealt with mass unrest, mostly led by laid-off workers and pensioners who are suffering as a direct result of economic reforms. So this view that in order to, that modernization would generate unrest, you need a social safety net to manage that discontent, and that's the only way you can have modernization make sense. However, then you have 1999, when thousands of Falun Gong practitioners surrounded Zhongnanhai and represented the largest collective action event in Beijing since Tiananmen 10 years prior. What's important here is that these protesters mobilized not because of economic grievances, but rather for social and political rights. And this I find is the beginning of the change in how the CCP thought about stability. So now, instead of understanding social unrest and instability as a result of economic development is seen as a way of maintaining what the CCP calls stability. So stability becomes the goal, and economic development serves that goal. So I think if we think about China today, these kind of circles on the right is a really familiar story. You have to have economic development and performance legitimacy. That's how you get stability. But that has not always been the case. And in fact, there was a view that economic modernization and economic reform would actually be destabilizing. So I should note that when I use the term stability, this is a term used by the CCP that conflates political stability, which is the survival of the single party regime, with social stability, which is the lack of collective action and social mobilization. So I think as researchers, we know that those are very different things. You can have social instability without any threat to political stability, but these things have been conflated by the CCP into this broader concept of stability. And this change really marks a fundamental shift in how the CCP understands stability. And it doesn't happen overnight, but you can see it in how they pursue political order. So in the aftermath of Tiananmen in 1989, you see the emergence of what's called comprehensive management of public security. So this is replacing previous strike hard campaigns, and it made the public security apparatus in China more powerful politically. And they adopted policies that linked promotion of officials to suppression of protests and social mobilization. But after Falun Gong protests, you see a revision of comprehensive management of public security, where the responsibility for maintaining public security moves beyond the public security apparatus. So this document from 1990, actually adopted in 2001, stated that all party and government organs can not only rely on public security to ensure political order, but needed to coordinate with other functional bureaucracies, including the civil affairs system, labor and social security, as well as education, health, and family planning systems. So these changes in how the CCP understood stability and pursued stability is what leads to the seepage of political order into the Dibao program. The formal rules of Dibao are never violated, but it changed the allocation of limited resources. And as a result, you have these two logics of distribution. So how does this work on the ground? Who are threats to political order? So there's an official designation for people who are seen as potential future threats to the CCP called 重点人口, or targeted populations. This category has been around since 1950. Who exactly falls into this category has changed a great deal over time. but they are people who the CCP does not have sufficient evidence to prosecute, but who are placed under surveillance and sometimes re-education and other control measures to prevent them from committing possible crimes in the future. So targeted populations today include those suspected of endangering state security, participating in public disturbances, riots, revolts, other actions that threaten public national security and social stability, those suspected of participating in cults, sects, secret societies, or illegal religious activities, those suspected of damaging national unity or inciting unrest. This also includes individuals who are suspected of having the potential to commit criminal activities such as murder, rape, human trafficking, theft, fraud, etc. And it includes people who have been released from prison or labor reform in the past few years. So as you can see, this targeted population category really combines a wide variety of activities. I should say that information about who's targeted is classified, and even the concept of 重点人口 is treated as an internal term. So I study them by looking at overlapping subsets of individuals that are more public. For example, re-education programs are public. Information about released prisoners is much less sensitive. And I just want to give you a few examples of this seepage of political order into the Dibao program. So after Falun Gong protests, you see public security and justice departments throughout the country issuing verbal instructions and policy documents that emphasize the provision of Dibao to targeted populations and other populations they wanted to control. So for example, in 2003, at the National Conference on Comprehensive Management of Public Security, the Minister of Civil Affairs and the Vice Minister of Justice emphasized the importance of living support for targeted populations. And the Minister of Civil Affairs said that targeted populations who meet Dibao eligibility requirements should be provided Dibao status and funds. In 2004, county in Ningbo began to actively recruit targeted populations for Dibao. In 2005, neighborhoods in Zhejiang province began helping former prisoners getting Dibao. In 2007, Nanjing's Bureau of Justice wrote that for targeted populations who meet Dibao criteria, they should be provided with those benefits. In 2008, you see a district in Beijing implementing policies that prioritize social assistance benefits to release prisoners and other individuals undergoing community correction. I also try to establish empirically this relationship between threats to disorder and Dibao provision, because targeted populations does cover a really broad array of individuals. So I conducted a randomized experiment among all counties in China with government websites, where we submitted requests to the government website about how getting help in obtaining Dibao. In the control condition, we provided information about economic hardship. And in the treatment condition, we provided the same exact information, but said, if the government did not help, we would find a solution with others facing similar problems. So this is a super vague threat of collective action. But as the plot on the right here shows, this treatment increased the responsiveness of county governments to requests for assistance in obtaining Dibao, and it also increased the amount of public responses. So the y-axis in the plot is the causal effect of the treatment condition, these threats of collective action. We see that both estimates are large and and statistically significant. So how often is Dibao distributed to preempt disorder? I conducted an original survey of 100 neighborhoods across cities in China. I selected cities in different regions, and in each city, I randomly sampled neighborhoods stratified by district. Among these neighborhoods, 89 of them had Dibao recipients. The average number of recipients was 48 per neighborhood, and the median was 28. In other words, in some neighborhoods, there were a relatively larger share of recipients. In 12 neighborhoods, released prisoners were among Dibao recipients. So this is out of 13 neighborhoods that had released prisoners, period. So this means that although it's relatively rare for there to be released prisoners in any neighborhood in urban China, when a neighborhood has released prisoners, almost always those released prisoners are receiving Dibao. And this contrasts with the general population of impoverished households that are receiving Dibao. Based on research by China's Bureau of Statistics and China's Academy of Social Sciences, they find that only 20 to 30% of households who are eligible based on income are receiving Dibao. So if you're a normal impoverished household, you're more likely to be turned away from Dibao. If you're a released prisoner, which is a subset of targeted populations, if you are poor, you're almost certain to be receiving Dibao. So what are the consequences of distributing Dibao to preempt disorder? I argue that giving Dibao to preempt threats to political order results in repressive assistance. So this is a term I coined in the book, and it's what occurs when material benefits are given to increase a contender's cost of taking action. So we usually associate political repression with physical sanctions and violence, imprisonment, or at the very least, the threat of physical force, like intimidation or surveillance. But if we look at older definitions of repression, it's really any action by a group which raises the contender's cost of collective action. And so this concept of repressive assistance builds on this recognition that repression doesn't need to be physically violent or even threaten physical violence in order to raise the cost of collective action for those who seek to engage in it. In repressive assistance, the distribution of benefits creates opportunities for repeated interactions between the individual and the state. It serves to make recipients more legible to the state by facilitating surveillance. If you're receiving benefits for any social welfare program, you have to provide a lot of information to the government. Also, this distribution of benefits makes individuals more amenable to influence through the development of bonds of obligation and dependence. And ultimately, those who receive these material benefits are not only less willing, but less able to engage in activities that the regime wants to suppress. So the use of welfare in authoritarian countries has been widely acknowledged and studied, but repressive assistance differs in a couple of ways. First, it's not co-optation or clientelism. In co-optation, benefits are distributed to buy off people who in exchange willingly forgo some specific activities. So in co-optation, a target decides, okay, the value of these benefits is worth me changing my behavior in some way. In repressive assistance, there's no exchange. It's also not clientelistic or contractual because the individual receiving the benefit is not almost never willingly entering into an agreement from which he or she can withdraw. And another way that repressive assistance differs from a lot of existing studies of welfare in authoritarian countries is that in most existing studies, it focuses on how these countries design welfare programs to achieve political goals. But in this case, the reason why Dibao acts as repressive assistance is not by design, but through this gradual process of institutional change through seepage. Okay, so to wrap up, I also want to talk a little bit about the consequences of distributing Dibao to preempt disorder. I should say that for people who are receiving Dibao, the provision of these benefits is demobilizing. So in my data, there's not a lot of these individuals, but of those who are receiving the benefits who might fall into targeted populations, it seems that they're very much demobilized. But because Dibao only covers this relatively small portion of the population, I really want to know about the consequences for people who don't receive benefits. And what I find there is backlash. I'll show you a couple of pieces of evidence of that. And the one thing to note is that this backlash is not because people are upset Dibao is being used for repressive purposes. It's because of anger over who is deserving of benefits. So this is based on my survey of 100 neighborhoods. What I find is that in neighborhoods where there are more released prisoners who are getting Dibao, residence committees are more likely to report individual complaints. In this, the y-axis here is a probability of complaints. And then you have two estimates: how likely are complaints when Dibao is given to release prisoners, how likely are complaints when there's no Dibao to prisoners, and the first difference. As you can see, the difference between such neighborhoods in complaints is statistically significant. I see the same pattern in terms of collective complaints. So these are collective complaints to the neighborhood. And when Dibao is given to release prisoners, you see higher probability of collective complaints. I also look at kind of taking a step back up from the neighborhood level. I look at data on city level protests. And I find that in cities where there are more policies explicitly linking targeted population to Dibao distribution, there are more protests. And in particular, there are more welfare protests. So in this plot, the y-axis is the average number of collective action events per city per month. The estimates with the square are in cities where there's more Dibao for targeted populations. In the circle are cities with less Dibao for targeted populations. And you see that there's a higher level of protests, and especially welfare-related protests between these cities. I also look at how Dibao distribution affects assessment of local governments. So this is based on a nationally representative survey. Here, the y-axis is assessment of government capacity in 4 areas: capabilities in preserving stability, providing welfare, responding to the public, and controlling official corruption malfeasance. And again, in the square estimates are cities where there's more Dibao for targeted populations, and the circles less Dibao for targeted populations. And you can see that evaluations of local governments are lower on all of these dimensions among cities where there's more Dibao for targeted populations. And here I'm also controlling for other factors that might affect assessment of the government, like economic development, size of the population, crime in general. Okay, this is looking finally at trust and satisfaction with governments. And again, we don't see any difference for the central government in terms of trust or satisfaction, but we do see lower levels of trust and satisfaction in local government, city governments. Okay. So with any book on China, there's the inevitable question of what does this mean for the durability and survival of the Chinese regime? And some people who've heard me talk about this book, they'll say, well, it looks like Dibao is working really well for political order. Without Dibao, if you got rid of the program, there'd probably be a lot more discontent. And targeted populations who get Dibao are demobilized. And others who don't get it, they complain, but they're low-level complaints that don't really threaten the regime. So for me, I think that's not the right way to think about it. The right comparison is what would happen if Dibao were fully funded? What would happen if the priority of political order did not seep into Dibao and other programs? And the result of my research shows that despite the Chinese government's really high level of state capacity and capability, its fixation on political order in many ways undermines the programmatic promises that the government has made. And appears, really unlikely right now that China will loosen its grip on social control and turn away from its pursuit of order. So what may end up happening is a cycle of tightening of political control in order to try to mitigate the problems produced by its quest for that control in the first place. Thank you so much for having me. I look forward to your questions and to the discussion. Thank you.